Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Sukkah Daf Ches begins with an Agadah Gemara discussing the midos of Rabbi Eliezer and what he learned from his Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ranked amongst the Talmidim of Hillel HaZaken, and some descriptions of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's midos. Then we get to a Mishnah which discusses the famous machlokes as to whether or not your table has to be in the sukkah, machlokes b'Hillel v'Shammai, and then the end of the Mishnah discusses who is obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah, women, children, and avadim. The Gemara will discuss how we derive women's obligation or lack thereof from the pasuk, how it compares to their obligation in Yom Kippur, other sources for the same halach on why we need both, and how they don't conflict. Then we'll also discuss a ger and how he applies. That's a ger taishav. And then we'll define what a katan is as far as these halachos. Then near the end of the daf, we'll get to another Mishnah, which will discuss what a person's obligation in the sukkah is. What does he have to do in the sukkah? What is he supposed to do in the sukkah? And the Gemara will discuss learning in the sukkah. Is that something he's supposed to do or not? So first of all, we had said in the end of the previous daf that Rabbi Eliezer did not say anything, any halacha that he did not hear explicitly from his Rebbe. So the Gemara describes this with a brisa. Or brings a brisa that when Rabbi Eliezer spent Shabbos in the upper Galil region, they asked him 30 halachos, and 12 of them and 18 of them, they were divided into 12 and 18. Some of them he said either 12 he answered and 18 he said that he didn't hear, or the opposite, 12 he didn't hear and 18 he answered. Different versions of how the story went, according to Rabbi Huda and the Tana Kama. The Brisa continues that they asked him, you don't say anything that you didn't hear, you don't know anything besides what you heard from your Rebbe. So he said, look, if you're forcing me, I'll tell you what my midos are, what I do. And this is what he said. I don't say anything over, I don't say any halacha that I did not hear explicitly from my Rebbe in all my days. Nobody ever came into the Beis Medrash before me. I was always the first one there. I never slept in the Beis Medrash, not a nap and not a deep sleep. I never left the Beis Medrash when anybody else was there. I never spoke anything besides for Torah in the Beis Medrash, never in Sichas Chulin, and I never said anything that my Rebbe never said. So that means I never missed anything that my Rebbe said, because I was always the first one in and the last one out, and therefore these things weren't said, and therefore I cannot tell you what the halacha is. The Gemara says this was a midah that he learned from his Rebbe Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Eliezer was the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Gemara lists the midas of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, which include these. He said, the Gemara says, in all his days of Yochanan ben Zakkai never spoke sichas chulin. He never spoke regular speech. He never walked 4 amos without learning Torah and without wearing tefillin. No one ever came to the Beis Medrash before him. He never slept in the Beis Medrash, not a permanent sleep and not a temporary sleep. He never thought in Torah in filthy alleyways. He never left the Beis Medrash when anyone was still there. Nobody ever came and saw him sitting still without learning. He was always doing something, learning, reviewing of some sort. No one ever opened the door for his Talmidim besides for him himself. He always opened the door himself. And he also never said anything over that he never heard from his Rebbe. He never said it's time to leave the Beis Medrash, except for 2 days a year of Pesach, when he said time to go bring the carbon in Pesach, and Yom Kippur when he said we have to go eat Sudas HaMafsekes, lest we get stuck with not being able to eat before Yom Kippur begins. And Rabbi Eliezer, his Talmud, learned all these customs from him. Now the Gemara brings a brisa discussing Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's learning. The Gemara says that Hillel HaZaken had 80 Talmidim. 30 of them were on the level to have the Hashras HaShechina, the presence of the Shechina in them, like Moshe Rabbeinu. 30 of them are on the level of Yeshua ben Nun, that they could have stopped the sun in its tracks, and the other 20 were in between. The greatest of all 80 was Yonas ben Uziel, and the least, the smallest of all of them, was Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And they said about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that he knew everything. There was not a single pasuk, mishnah, gemara, halacha, agada, halacha dirabanan, limud, things that you could learn out of a limud of divrei Torah, halacha Moshe miSinai, things learned from Kal V'chomer, things learned from Zerah Shava, movement of the stars and the heavenly bodies, gematrias, including things learned from Atbash and Atbach, different ways of learning things from letter switches and the numeric value of words. He knew all that, in addition to all the conversations and the language of the Malachei Ashares, of the Shadim, of the trees. He knew all the parables, all the fables and lessons that can be learned that are about washer women and about foxes. He knew all these things. He knew everything big. He knew everything small. Everything big refers to the Ma'aser Merkava. Everything small refers to the questions and the answers that Abaye and Rava would later say over. And this is all a fulfillment of the pasuk in Mishnah that says, "Lahanchal oyev hayesh v'yisayim amale." Hashem fills up the knowledge and the storehouses of those who are beloved to him and who love him. So now the Gemara says, imagine if this is the level of Yochanan Zakkai, who was the smallest of the Talmidim of Hillel Hazakin. Imagine the level of Yonas ben Uzziel, who was the greatest. And it says the Gemara that at the time he would sit and learn, any bird that would fly over his head would be burned. Rashi explains because the Malachim would come to hear the learning that he said. Okay, this takes us to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah begins by discussing somebody who's himself in the sukkah, but his table is not. As we've seen earlier in the Masechta, there's a machlokas whether this is telling you what the size has to be, or it's telling you actually have to have your table in the sukkah. Does it have to be that your sukkah is big enough to hold the table, or is it saying that the table has to actually be there? The simple language of the Mishnah is saying that the table has to actually be there. And it says that somebody who's in the sukkah, where he's in the sukkah, and his head is in the sukkah, the majority of his body's in the sukkah, that's because he's reclining, but his table is outside the sukkah. Says Machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai if he's yaitzer. Beis Shammai says no good, and Beis Hillel says it is good. The Gemara says Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, "Don't you know the story where the elders of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, those were the generations before them, went to visit Rabbi Yochanan ben Hachoranis, and they found him that he was sitting his head and the majority of his body in the sukkah, but the table was outside the sukkah, and they didn't say anything. So he's a proof to us that is not a problem." Beis Shammai answered them, and he said, "You got it backwards. It's a proof the other way." They said to him at that time, they said, "If this is what you do, you have never fulfilled the mitzvah of sukkah in your life." Okay, now the end of the Mishnah discusses who's obligated in sukkah. It says women, avadim, and children are pater in sukkah. A katan, though, a child who is not old enough, he doesn't need his mother anymore, is chayiv in sukkah. The Gemara will explain how those two things don't contradict. And then another contradictory statement, which the Gemara will explain as well, is that the daughter-in-law of Shammai Hazakin gave birth, and Shammai went and peeled off the plaster from the ceiling over his crib and made the ceiling boards into schach so that he would be in the sukkah. Okay, now the Gemara begins, and its first discussion is about women not being chayiv in the mitzvah of sukkah. So the Gemara says, how do you know the women are not chayiv in the mitzvah of sukkah? The Gemara says, because when the Torah describes the mitzvah, it says, Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshuv ha'sukkos, all the ezrach, all the citizens of Yisrael should sit in the sukkah. So the Gemara says, ha'ezrach is an exclusionary phrase. If it would have just said ezrach, citizens of Israel have to sit in the sukkah, that would have referred to men and women together. Ha-ezrach means the citizens, that's a limiting phrase, and therefore it's only men who are obligated in sukkah, not women. The Gemara says this is very contradictory to what we said in Maseches Yoma about the mitzvah of fasting on Yom Kippur. Over there we said that if it would just say ezrach, that would refer to just men, but ha-ezrach, the extra hay is to include women. So I don't understand the Gemara says. In Hilchos Sukkah, you're telling me that the extra hay is limiting, it's excluding the women, and in Yoma, in Yom Kippur, you're telling me that it's including the women. That's question number one. Question number two, the Gemara says, is why do we need any limudim? We have limudim very clearly, which show me what the halacha is. We know that the halacha is that sukkah is a mitzvah sasesha zman grama. It's a mitzvah you can only do sometimes. Other times of the year there's no such mitzvah, and it's a positive commandment, something you're supposed to do. The halacha is across shas that a woman is not obligated in that. Now Yom Kippur is a mitzvah leisaseh, something you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. You're not allowed to do any of the 5 things that are forbidden on Yom Kippur. Now mitzvah is leisaseh, even if it's time limited, women are obligated in. So why do I need any of these psukim? So the Gemara says what's actually happening is as follows. The word ha-ezrach with the extra hey implies one way or the other. It doesn't imply both ways. We're not sure which one. And the other way is halacha l'mashmi Sinai. And so we have Yom Kippur where it's including. We have Sukkot where it's excluding. It's only really used one of the 2 ways. The Gemara hasn't specified yet which one. We'll see soon. The other way is halacha l'mashmi Sinai, that is either including or excluding, and the Gemara just uses the pasuk as an asmachta, but it's not really including or excluding. It's the opposite. So the Gemara says, well, which is which? So the Gemara says that Abaye and Rava say that really the word ha'ezrach is an inclusory phrase. It's including. And Halach l'Moshe Sinai by Sukkah excludes. So the pasuk is specific as far as Yom Kippur to include women, that they are included in the obligation. And by Sukkah we have Halach l'Moshe Sinai that excludes women, and it's just on Asmachta we have a hint to it from the word Ha'ezrach, but that's not really what it's meant to do. So now the Gemara has to deal with the fact that we don't need the two psukim because we have Halach l'Moshe Sinai and Losasei, and we know those halachas. So the Gemara says you need them for the following reasons. As far as Sukkah, even though it's mitzvah sasesha has man grama, and therefore women should be automatically excluded without Halach l'Moshe Sinai telling you that they're excluded, you still have to have the exclusion. And here you have Abaye and Rava giving different reasons. Abaye says it might be because the Torah says Teishvu, and we know Teishvu came to Duru, you're supposed to live in the Sukkah like you live in your house, and just like in the house, man and woman live together in the same house. You may think in the Sukkah also the man and the woman should live together in the Sukkah, and therefore women are obligated. Therefore, the Halach l'Moshe Sinai comes and says women are not obligated. Rava says the reason is because we have a link between Sukkot and Pesach. Both are on the 15th of the month, and therefore you may think just like on Pesach women are chayev in the mitzvah of eating matzah, as we learn from a drasha there. So too you may think that it's true here, and therefore you need the Halach l'Moshe Sinai to exclude it. Now, as far as what is the extra hay then actually for? Now that we know that on Sukkot it's not doing anything, it's Halach l'Moshe Sinai, we're using it as a hint, but what's it actually for? So the Gemara says, well, just like by Yom Kippur, it's really an including phrase. Here it's also an including phrase, and it's including a ger Taishav, that he is also obligated in the mitzvah of Sukkah. If I would have only said Ezrach, I would have thought that excluding a ger, Ezrach is to include a ger. Now, as far as Yom Kippur, why do I need a pasuk specifically to say that women are chayav? We should just say they're obligated in the Inoi, just like they're obligated in every Inoi. Gemara says that's because the Torah specifically limits it, as we've seen in Yoma, that there is no mitzvah of tosefes Inoi. You don't have to start fasting before Yom Kippur a little bit. You don't have to keep fasting a little bit afterwards. It's limited in that sense. It's cut down. You may think that also women are cut out of it. Therefore, the Torah says, ha'ezrach, you have to include the women. They are also obligated in the fasting. Okay, now the Gemara refers back to the Mishnah to discuss ketanim. So we had said that kol, the phrase kol ha'ezrach includes ketanim, that children are also obligated in sitting in the sukkah. So the Gemara says, but what do you mean? You just said in the Mishnah, women, avadim, and children are not obligated in the sukkah. The Gemara says what it means to say is that a child who is old enough, has reached the age of education, where you're supposed to start getting him used to and learning the mitzvahs, he is obligated to sit in the sukkah as education. So Gemara says education, that's practice. That's not a mitzvah d'oraisa. How can you learn out of a pasuk of kol ha'ezrach? Gemara says, you're right, it's not really learned from kol ha'ezrach, it's really a mitzvah d'rabanan of chinuch. It's only a hint, it's an asmachta from the pasuk where we say that it's learned from kol ha'ezrach, it's not an actual limud. Okay, now, the Mishnah defined the age at which a child should be sitting in the sukkah as from when he's old enough that he does not need his mother anymore. The Gemara says, what's called needing the mother? The Gemara says, any child, at least the first approach, Rabbi Yanai, the Bei Rabbi Yanai says, as long as he needs his mother to clean him after using the restroom, that's called a katan who needs his mother. Once he can take care of himself, then he doesn't need his mother anymore, and he should be in the sukkah. The second approach to this, the Gemara says, is Rabbi Shimon, or Rebbe, depending on the Girsa, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, is that the ages where he wakes up and he doesn't call Ima, doesn't call his mother in the night. The Gemara says, what do you mean? Every child, for every age, calls their mother in the night. The Gemara says, okay, some cry Ima, they keep calling until the mother comes, and some just call once and wait, and they don't keep on crying. And that's the age at which they are called not needing the mother, and they should be sleeping in the sukkah and eating in the sukkah. Okay, now the Gemara asks, why did we bring a story where Shammai made a sukkah even for the baby who was an infant just born? We just said that you're only obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah as a child. If you're old enough, you don't need your mother anymore. So this is a contradictory story. So the Gemara says, you're missing a line here. It means to say that you're allowed to be machmer. You're allowed to be machmer to have a child of any age in the sukkah. Like Shammai, who made a sukkah even for the baby. He made over the crib, he made a kosher sukkah in the ceiling. Okay, now we get to our next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses what a person is supposed to do in the sukkah, and it says all 7 days a person should make his sukkah his house, and his actual house should be a temporary place that he goes into here and there. If it's raining, when should you leave the sukkah? So the Gemara says you're allowed to leave the sukkah when the stew gets soggy. That means to say, Rashi defines it as a type of food which is not hard and not soft. It's kind of of a thick consistency. When the water gets mixed into it to the extent that it becomes ruined because it's too loose, then it's time to get out of the sukkah. The Mishnah says that this is like where a servant brings a cup of wine for his master, and the master takes the cup and throws it in his face. Well, the Mishnah doesn't specify who throws it in whose face, but it says he throws it in his face, doesn't say who throws what. Okay, now the Gemara begins by quoting a brisa that shows, it quotes two brises very similar that show us the source for this halacha. Teishu again Taduru, again you should live like you live in your house. Just like you live in your house, you should live in the sukkah, and therefore the sukkah should be your permanent place. You should be visiting the house, but spending your permanent residence should be in the sukkah. How should you do it? So you should bring all your most fancy and beautiful kalim to the sukkah. Your best sheets, pillows, blankets, all those things should be out in the sukkah. Eat, drink, and mitayel, kind of putter around in the sukkah itself. Now the second brisa also adds you should learn Mishnah. You should learn it says Mishanein b'sukkah, that usually refers to learning Gemara, the svaras and the reasoning of the Mishnah. So the Gemara says, are you really supposed to learn Gemara? The Rava says he's supposed to learn psukim and mishnayos in the Mishnah, but that implies not actual Gemara. That's too deep, that's too involved, and you'll stop thinking about the sukkah, and you'll be distracted in the sukkah. So Gemara says there's two ways of learning Gemara. Gemara's learned it two ways. One is where you review quickly, you just go over the actual statements, or something that's already clear, or something which you just learned. And then there's the actual thinking, the deep iyun that's involved, that you should do out of the sukkah. Gemara says an example, that Rabbi Bar Chama, when he stood before Rav Chizda, he would first repeat over what he said quickly, and then they would start discussing it deeper in Svara. Now, says Rava, here's a list of things which should or shouldn't be in the sukkah. Cups could be in the sukkah, they're not disgusting. Plates and other food, kalim, you should take out of the sukkah, shouldn't leave them there. Shouldn't leave dirty plates in the sukkah. A wooden pail and a earthenware pail should be outside the sukkah. The candle should be outside the sukkah. Others say candle should be inside the sukkah. This is not an argument. Depends on the size of the sukkah. If it's a minimum size of sukkah, keep the candle out of there so you don't catch fire on the schach. If it's a bigger sukkah, you can keep the candle in there, you don't have to worry about it.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.